everybody. Welcome to another Psychedelic Today podcast with your host, David Drapkin. Today, we're talking with Jim Gilligan from Tryp Therapeutics. Lovely to see you, Jim. How are you doing?
Great seeing you, David, as well.
Yeah, so we did have back in January, Greg, the CEO from Tryp, on the show. It was great to find out more. And today, quite a lot's happened in that time. You're now in the hot seat, President, Chief Scientific Officer, and Interim CEO at Tryp. So tell us, what's it like at the moment in the hot seat there at Tryp? What kind of things are you working on, and what's kind of keeping you so excited about what's, what you've got in store?
Keeping me excited and up at night. So we're making a lot of critical advances. One of the things that we wanted to do at Tryp was to differentiate ourselves from some of the other folks in the sector, and we've done that by trying to bring in people who are seasoned in the biotech pharmaceutical sector, understanding what it takes to have a drug approved, understanding all the different pieces, and looking at what will it require to get a psychedelic approved as an ethical pharmaceutical. And I think we assembled a team that could do that. And one of the goalposts of that would be, can you get your protocol through the FDA? Can you get that approved so that you can start clinical studies? And as you know, as Greg stated, that we had two INDs go through the FDA process, and we were given what's called an allowance to proceed. And so that sort of checks the box that we know what we're doing. We're able to interact with the FDA and conduct proper clinical studies. The other thing that we wanted to look at was, where is there unmet medical need? And certainly, Compass is looking at treatment-resistant depression. Other companies are looking at anxiety and addiction. And we wanted to look at other areas where we thought psychedelics would have a benefit. And so we selected the two. One, what we call nociplastic pain, which includes fibromyalgia, complex regional pain syndrome, phantom limb. And as people are aware, we partnered with University of Michigan to do a study in fibromyalgia. And then we looked at eating disorders, and the first study is in binge eating disorder at the University of Florida. So if you think about it, that's the path we've elected to go down, and we've made continuing progress there, David, right? And to the point where we've enrolled our first patient at University of Florida. We've dosed the first patient, and we're really excited about what's happening there and with what we'll be doing going forward at University of Michigan.
Great to hear that you've got those collaborations set up with those universities, and doing the drug development is a long game. And I'm very interested to take a step back, Jim, and hear about your path before you kind of entered this psychedelic drug development role. Like, I don't know what led you to get here, but what was happening before in life, before you kind of joined Tryp?
I think that's super interesting for me. I have a PhD in pharmacology. I did a postdoc in molecular biology, and worked in for a biotech company for 28 years. And so I did everything from bench scientist up through, it was interesting. Who wants to do preclinical? You raise your hand. Okay, I'll do pre. Who wants to do clinical? Raise your hand. Who wants to do regulatory? And so I learned by doing all of the different components of drug discovery, drug development. And then as we continued, I actually went back and got an MBA in international business to understand what it takes once you have a product to do licensing and understanding that component. And so I have a broad background. I was in the biotech sector. We were doing peptides and proteins in cardiovascular, in pain, in diabetes, different areas where those types of therapeutics were relevant. And at the end of that, I was involved in submitting NDAs and drug approvals. I got involved in doing some consulting, figuring that I had this wealth of experience. By making all the mistakes early on, I could help people not make the same mistakes. And with respect to Tryp, what happened is they had an oncology asset, and they said, "Hey, Jim, we'd like you to come in and consult and look at that." And so I came in, I thought it was pretty interesting, gave some advice about how I thought it'd be great adjunctive therapy. And then they asked me, "Hey, we have this thing called the PFN program, our CNS program." And I was kidding them at the time. I said, "Guys, I don't do CNS." And they go, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "Well, I like cardiovascular." And they go, "Why is that?" I said, "It's pretty simple. It's it's pumps and plumbing. I said, once you get into the brain, it's difficult. And they said, well, come on, we just take a look. And I said, fine. And I started looking at what the whole field of psychedelics. And because I really haven't been involved in CNS to any great extent, and certainly not psychedelics, I had to do some homework. I had to do some reading to get myself up the learning curve. And the more I read, the more intrigued I became. And so they asked me to come in initially just as sort of an interim CSO and look at their programs and help uh, uh, provide some insight and some guidance. And what happened during that time is they already had Robin Carhart Harris on as one of their scientific advisors, and they said, Jim, feel free to contact Robin and use him as a resource to help you understand the psychedelic sector. And looking at Robin, understanding, you have someone who's been on the cover of Time magazine, I was a little bit intimidated, but, nevertheless, had a couple of Zoom calls with Robin, and he was just great. He was so relaxed and really so kind to me to sort of explain things. And, it was he got me to the point where I was very, very comfortable speaking with him. And I always like telling these anecdotes, and Robin remembers this. So we're having a discussion, and I'm peppering him with all these questions. And he looks at me, he says, Jim, is it safe to say you've never done psychedelics? And I go, is it that obvious? He's quite. And it was just this wonderful point where he just really spent the time to try to get me to understand. And the more I understood, it was intriguing because as a pharmacologist, you get involved and you're thinking about how drugs bind receptors and the standard approach. And I realized that with psychedelics, it's much different. It's a much different approach, and it's really exciting. And so, in speaking with him and his experience, and the thing that struck me, and I still remember this, is if you look at his publications, even New England Journal of Medicine publication, what struck me was that with one or two drug interventions, you see this durability of response for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. And so to me, that just, again, having a degree in pharmacology, well, certainly the drug's not around. So you're having this profound effect in the brain, in the CNS, that's having this effect that's beneficial. And so let's start looking at this differently. And I literally just became fascinated with this concept of using psychedelics in an innovative way to treat unmet medical need.
Yeah. So, Jim, I've got to ask you the question.
Yeah,
So Robin already asked you, you didn't have familiarity or
yeah,
experience with psychedelics. So now that you're working in this industry with these molecules, and we're talking about the brain
yeah,
and CNS, instead of, say cardio issues.
yeah.
Are you tempted, or
Oh,
have you been experiencing anything?
so
And we can
again,
always edit this out if you want. I promise.
no, so it's funny. Just I do this because I love doing research and I have fun. I'm at a stage in my career where I can afford to do that. And
Mm.
again, telling a quick story. So at the University of Michigan, you have what's called inclusion exclusion criteria. So they had set the time at a certain age, and I go, hey, I think that we should increase that age by a couple of years. And they go, why is that? I said, so I can get in the study. And so yeah, I do believe it would be beneficial for me to have that experience so I could relate to what's going on with the patients. And I've talked to people who've been in clinical studies. I have people who've just done recreational shrooms. I've had those conversations, and certainly yeah, afforded the opportunity, that was something that I would be able to, I think, better relate to both the clinicians that we're speaking to and what's going to happen to the patients. So yeah, I would how can I say it, avail myself to that opportunity if it was presented to me.
All right, it sounds like it's going to happen. Just
Yeah.
we need the right set and setting,
Yeah.
and maybe Robin can help with that.
Yeah.
Because yeah, I'm thinking that there are some training programs that MAPS does with MDMA, where therapists, within a certain cohort of their work, get access to MDMA as part of their training. And in Oregon, with the psilocybin, there's an experiential component where psilocybin or breathwork could be part of that, around the familiarity with non-ordinary states of consciousness.
And I think in this area, it's particularly different. I worked in hypertension, so you take a blood, you can put on a cuff and figure out whether your blood pressure goes down, but this is profoundly different. And as I say, every day I have to think about this just a little bit differently because it's a different paradigm, and it's something that we as an organization continue to refine the more we learn, and we feel optimized because we want to give the molecule the best shot at being successful, right? We don't want the failure to be, if it's not going to work, let's make sure it's not going to work because the pharmacology, the biology of the drug didn't work, not because we didn't plan correctly, not because we didn't test correctly. And so I think that's the challenge, to have the right set and setting, to have the right protocol, to have the right patient population, to give the molecule the best shot at showing whether or not it's going to be beneficial or not.
Let's take a dive into the molecule itself. And there is a big discussion out there around, can you patent psilocybin? Is that kind of bona fide IP? Is it novel? So I want to touch on that, and I want to
Yeah.
get a bit more understanding around how is Tryp understanding the benefits of psilocybin, around whether it's kind of raw, natural, organic, whether it's an extract, or whether it's synthesized. So how did that decision making process go about the form of psilocybin to try to use with the molecule?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think where I started was that one of our path that we elected to go down was an ethical pharmaceutical. And if you look at what you need to do in an IND and an NDA, it's module 3 is called CMC, chemistry, manufacturing, control. And from an FDA perspective, having a drug that's chemically synthesized gives you consistency, reproducibility, that it's traditional. That's what they expect to see. Um, there's also a little bit of an IP component to that you can patent, the process on which you make the molecule, the polymorphs and things like that. But more importantly, you just have a consistent, reproducible molecule that you need for drugs. The other thing that people might not understand or aren't in the field is not just that you have um, actual real psilocybin, but it's the impurity profile. You have to meet a certain spec. So if you're extracting from nature and there's some variability there, you could have a difference in your impurity profile, which has an impact on your ability to use the batch. So for us, the using a standard pharmaceutical approach to a chemical synthesis um, was the best approach, and so we that's what we elected to do, so that, and we have an exclusive contract with Curia to manufacture the drug for us, so that we know we'll have an uninterrupted drug supply, and we also have an exclusive contract with them that again will help sort of on not exactly IP, but at least giving us some level of exclusivity.
Mm. And so this contract with Curia, you're saying it's exclusive. They'll produce the psilocybin. What kind of psilocybin containing mushroom
Yeah.
is it? Because there's
Okay.
potentially hundreds
So
out there.
yeah.
Do you
So
know
here's
the kind of
so
this type?
here's yeah. So this is and the IP thing is fascinating. I haven't been in the biotech sector. You can't patent normal biological molecules in your body. So you can't patent human insulin in your body, right? So I've been involved in how do you create intellectual property around natural molecules. As an aside, I did a joint venture in China for 8 years in dealing with natural products, TCMs, and understanding other natural products. So I'm familiar with the field. Um, so what we did is something perhaps a little bit different. So we have what's called Trip 8802. And Trip 8802 is your standard oral psilocybin that we actually source from USONA Institute. And what we wanted to do, since we were looking at two new areas for psychedelics, right? That being overeating disorders and nociplastic pain. We said, hey, before we develop our own proprietary approach, let's use what's out there right now, do a small exploratory study, no placebo, give everybody psilocybin, and let's see if it has an effect, right? Does it perform as expected? My old boss was Canadian. He said, Jim, you always have to determine if there's a there there. So that's what we want to do. If we give oral psilocybin, do we see the expected outcome?
And that
And
was
so
with those
that's
two indications in particular, Jim.
and for those two
So
indications. And
overeating
so that
disorder and
way,
nociplastic pain, you said, yeah?
yeah. And so
Yeah.
that's how we're doing. That's what we're dosing in the binge eating disorder, and
Mm.
that's what we'll be dosing in the fibromyalgia study. So while that's going on, and we're looking at what the response is, it gives us time to develop what we consider Tryp 8803, which is our proprietary formulation that I'll get to. The other thing that we realized is that, again, when we're talking about what's the difference between these psychedelics and standard drugs, if I'm looking at a standard ethical pharmaceutical, you have a primary endpoint. Okay, it's going to decrease blood pressure. And that's what you look at. With psychedelics, you have a constellation of changes. You have things that affect the person's behavior, their mood, anxiety. And so, what we wanted to do in our studies is look at a number of different responses, not just did they eat less or did they have less pain. And by doing these initial studies, it helps us refine our clinical approach for when we go forward into 8803. So one will know we have the answer to the test ahead of time. Yes, it works. And we also have a sense of what are the best parameters that demonstrate that it works? What was important to the patient? What did they feel the most significant outcome of the study was that helped them dealing with either overeating or pain? And so that helps us as we move into the more complicated studies. We have an idea of what's the appropriate endpoints to measure, what's most substantial and important to the patient. And so I think using this approach of off the shelf oral to do this initial investigation is really going to be beneficial for us as we develop 8803. As in any natural product, one of the things that you can do is you can get what's called use patents. And the example that I use from my background is Eli Lilly had a patent on a product called teriparatide. And what that was, it's PTH is a hormone in your body. It was a piece of that everybody knew about it. But what they were able to patent was the 20 microgram injectable dose that was used in their clinical study in an injectable formulation. They became $1 billion product, yet nobody could duplicate that because they had a patent. So I always use that as an example in areas like psychedelics, natural products, that what you need to do is come up with the correct dose, the correct formulation, maybe something that stabilizes the molecule, something that can give you a proprietary position, and importantly protect if we're the first in overeating, if they're first in pain, so that the Tryp version will have the IP protection. And I know sometimes people look at this and say, well, why would you need IP protection? Well, when you realize that it costs probably close to $1 billion now to develop a drug all the way through, the company needs to have an ability to recoup some of that in order to continue. And so without a patent, then you're not going to have that ability to recoup your investment. And so that's the balance there.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that. And there is an argument, and I sometimes, to be honest, Jim, feel conflict around IP and patents with psilocybin containing mushrooms, because they're in their raw form, they kind of grow all around the world, they've been used for generations. So I'm interested on a molecular level, like what is it that is unique, and what changes in the molecular structure potentially for 8803 that you're working on that makes it particularly effective, perhaps for those two indications that you're working on. But from your science background, could you talk us through on a molecular level when
Yeah.
it gets tweaked by that, in the lab? What is it that changes that makes it effective?
Yeah. So well, I can't wait to have another discussion with you in the fall when we can reveal what 8803 is, because our patent will be published then. So I can
Ah,
give you
okay.
the details. But here's what happened. So in talking with Robin, one of the things that he shared with me was that in his studies he had circumstances where maybe a woman would come in who weighs 65 kilos, take, and she'd be looking at him like, is this all that's going to happen? And not really enter the psychedelic state. He'd have a 100-kilo guy come in and, be tripping all over the place. And so I went back to the literature, and there was a publication in 2017 by Brown et al. that talked about what the blood levels are after after taking an oral formulation, and they were very exact. They actually administered the dose based upon weight. So I'll do an easy calculation. If the dose was zero point 0.3 mgs per kg and you weighed 100 kgs, you got a 30 mg dose. If you weighed 70, you got a 21 mg dose. So they actually weighed out the psilocybin, and they dosed at zero point 0.3 mgs per kg, 0.45 mgs per kg, and zero point 0.6 mgs per kg. And when I looked at the data, it became obvious that some of the people that got zero point 0.3 mg per kg had higher blood levels than those that had zero point 0.6 mg per kg. So that helped explain to me the conundrum that Robin had, where some patients don't really have much of a trip and others, have maybe even a bad trip. And so it seemed to me, let's go back to what I said before. You want to give the molecule, the drug, the best shot at success. Well, if you don't get requisite blood levels, it's not going to work. And if they're too high, you're going to have side effects. So what's causing that? So with my science background, I realized that whenever you take anything orally and you swallow it, right, it goes into the stomach, and you can have food effects, and then it has to get out of the stomach into the intestine. But what people may not realize is that anything you swallow and goes into blood, it doesn't go into the systemic circulation. It goes through the liver first. And so you could have an effect where it goes into the liver and very little gets out the other side to actually go into circulation. So that was one issue. The other thing is that psilocybin has really no biologic activity. In the body, it gets converted by an enzyme into psilocin. So if the person doesn't convert to psilocybin, like from a mushroom or the synthetic, into psilocin, you don't have the molecule that goes into the brain and binds to the receptors. So that's another variable that you need to take into account. So looking at that, we said, okay, we want to make sure that the patient gets at least the right dose and that's not too high, because we don't want them to have safety concerns. The other thing you start looking at is what I call target product profile. What's this drug going to be like when it grows up? And when someone takes the capsule, it could take an hour or two before they enter the psychedelic state. It could last for 6 or 8 hours. So you have, a couple therapists in the room with someone, for 8 or 10 hours to get them through the intervention. The other thing that you realize is once you swallow a capsule, you lose control. Whatever's going to happen happens. And if the dose is too high, or they have an idiosyncratic response, it could be serious for the patient. So we wanted to develop basically a better approach. And with 8803, our patent covers basically a novel route of administration, novel formulation, where basically we can assure that the patient enters the psychedelic state within about 30 minutes or so. We can control the duration of the experience. And both ways, if they're having a bad experience, we can terminate it. We can give a rescue drug, a serotonin antagonist to protect them. Or if the therapist feels they're having an incredible trip, you expand it to get the most clinical benefit from that. And so, and we can control to make sure that we get the right blood levels that are required to have the optimal approach. The other thing that you might think about is, all patients aren't created equal, or what you need to do for someone with overeating could be different from fibromyalgia. Someone who's had a chronic condition may need something a little bit different than more acute. And so we wanted to build in some flexibility, again, to customize to the patient. And that's what 8803 does. So we basically looked at the deficiencies with oral and just came up with an approach that addresses all of that. And and it comes back to the first thing I said. We really want to give the molecule the best shot at success. And by delivering the optimal dose for the optimal blood levels for the optimal time will certainly give it the best shot. And I think it also helps reduce your risk in the clinic. You want to be able to get the drug approved. Again, if you go through all this and you can't get it through the FDA review, then you're not going to help a single patient. And so it's really making sure that in the end analysis, you want to help the patients. That's why I got into this. People are altruistic. You want to create drugs that help people. And if you can't get it approved, then you're not going to help any of the patients. And so that's what we wanted to do, come up with the best mousetrap, the best approach that gives the drug the best opportunity to help the patient.
So I want to go into the trials themselves, but before we do, I'm very interested about why psilocybin in particular, and was there a process of flicking through the other psychedelic alternatives? Because other research doing LSD and DMT and MDMA.
Yeah.
So what is it about psilocybin, and what kind of thought process did the team go through to reach that?
Yeah, so that was one of the things I was interested in as well. And again, in speaking with Rob and others and Joe Castellanos and folks, and if you look at right now, there was a publication uh, with respect to an LSD study. I'm not going to say exactly what it was, but in that study there was a serious adverse event, right? In that the patient experienced an episode that was directly related to the drug, and so when we looked at LSD, it's like the Three Little Bears. Is it too strong? Is it just right, or too weak? And we felt that psilocybin gave the quality of the psychedelic experience that we felt was best fit for our clinical outcomes. And if you look at some of the neural network work that's been done and looking at what happens in neural networks after psilocybin and the reformation and neuroplasticity, we felt that the pharmacology and its binding 5-HT2A receptors and basically its pharmacology was consistent with what we wanted to achieve. And I've already told you a bunch of stories, but I'll tell you one more as we get into so we're having these discussions at University of Michigan, and those guys are absolutely awesome. And part of what you want to do is you want to align yourself with experts, and these guys are experts in fibromyalgia. And so we're in a study. They have like 12 or 14 people on their team, and the Tryp team's there. And they have these really, really bright people explaining to me about the modulation of messaging in the brain and, how this signaling it goes on. And so I'm listening, and Dan Claw is on the call. And Dan's been involved in a number of these things. He goes, "Hey, Jim, let me see if I can explain this to you." Because he could see I was like having a little difficulty. He goes, "Yeah, and the nosoplastic pain, the situation is the pain switch is stuck in the on position. We need to go in and turn it off. And we think that psilocybin is going to give us the opportunity to turn that pain switch off." And I'm like, I get that. I can understand it. And that's exactly what we're looking at in eating disorders and behavior. You have a switch that's turned on where people overeat or they're lacking the satiety switch. And so you're really trying to go in and ability to sort of reform and reorganize those networks. And it's pretty well known that psilocybin can allow you to do that. And so um, if when we talk with the therapist, and you would understand this, that they say that trying to reach that level of the subconscious is difficult, but given basically psilocybin is a tool that allows you to reach deeper into the subconscious. And that was one of the things that Robin was explaining to me early on. He explained it to me almost as a series of doors that you need to go through in order to get to the area that you need to address. And he was instrumental in me thinking about optimizing dose, because he felt in certain circumstances maybe you do need a higher dose, a higher exposure, a longer time. And how do you do that? And so having that in mind, that helped us figure out how we wanted to do 8803 to again provide that flexibility where if a patient needs a deeper, longer psychedelic experience, you could deliver that. And so that's what led us, and Robin's done work with DMT. He's looked at that, and he's looked at IV DMT. He's looked at a number of things, and he said, in that case, it was like a sledgehammer. It was just too intense, and so we wanted something that was patient friendly, and that if you're in a situation where you want to repeat this, that it's a pleasant, good experience, and that the patient would be willing to come back for repeated therapy.
Yeah. So I want to share a story, if that's okay, Jim. I know you're a storyteller, but I'll do my best as well here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So listening to what you're saying about this off switch in the brain, and it relates to pain. Like there's a part of the brain that kind of just needs to say, "Hey, just turn off the pain," as well as hunger and overeating. There's that part of the brain that needs to just know, "I am satiated. I can stop eating now." And when I used to live in New Zealand, 15 years ago, 12 years ago, I was doing some, community work with people that had disabilities. And one of the young clients, 17 years old perhaps, she had Prader-Willi syndrome, which I had never heard of until then. And she's the only person in my entire life I've ever met that has that syndrome, where basically she is always hungry, and no matter how much she would eat, it wouldn't say she has. She's always hungry, and she would eat anything. So chalk, plastic, anything that was just left out, it had to be locked away, and it was really hard to know what to do. So I'm sensing, I remember just feeling like I'm helpless in a sense, and her mum that we were working with, her mum was really helpless. Like, just I don't know how to help her. And I guess these treatments that we're working on here, you're working on it with Tryp. There must be some part of the brain, and perhaps it's psilocybin in particular that can open those multiple doors and pathways to get there to say, I'm hungry now. And it's like same with turning off that pain valve. And it's even with looking at addiction. Maybe it's a similar kind of cognitive process, that craving and that urge to use, that that same part of the brain that's saying, I'm satiated now. And there's other companies that work with addiction in particular that pinpoint that part of the brain, whether it's alcohol or opioid use disorder, just to reduce those cravings and be satiated. So I want to hear more about this.
Yeah, it's you're so right. And one of the things, so in my background, again, it's satiety. We were looking at, there's a number of peptides involved in satiety. So I actually worked on the ghrelins and the GLPs and all that, and we developed some analogs that really reduced that eating in dogs and rats and whatnot. But here was what intrigues me along those lines. If you look at people who have gastric bypass surgery or banding, what they show is that after 3 to 5 years, they start gaining weight again. And so what you've done is you've reduced their capacity for caloric intake, right? But you haven't changed the behavior that drove that in the beginning. So that's what I look at. When I'm looking at nosoplastic pain, I think about someone with phantom limb who's had a traumatic injury, they lose an arm, and yet now they have excruciating pain in an arm that no longer exists. So clearly the pain is emanating in the brain. So how do you get to that? And that also was something that intrigued me. If you think about it, for either the disorders you're talking about, where you overeat or pain, the standard pharmacologic approach or the standard approach has been, we're actually treating symptoms. If it's pain, we're giving a pain pill. We're not alleviating what's causing the pain. If you're overeating, you're trying to give something to quench their appetite, but you're not correcting what's driving that appetite. And so as I started looking at it, it's like, wow, this is where we can go further up to the etiologic factor driving this, and not just putting a Band-Aid on, not just treating the symptoms. And it's incredible that you mentioned Prader-Willi syndrome, because Dr. Jennifer Miller at University of Florida is a world expert in Prader-Willi
Oh,
syndrome.
wow.
And that was the initial, actually, we were thinking about Prader-Willi syndrome. And part of I said we think about these things to a large extent, is that some of the Prader-Willi syndrome patients are cognitively impaired. And we thought that starting with that and inducing a psychedelic state might be difficult for them. And so something that's similar to that is what's called hypothalamic induced obesity. And that's where there's damage to the hypothalamus. Usually a patient could have what's called a craniopharyngioma. They take the tumor out, the patient's fine. But when they damage the hypothalamus, it's just what you said, they have this insatiable need to eat. And Dr. Miller shared two stories that just, you read about these things and it's okay, yeah, they overeat. And she gave two stories. One, she had a patient with HO who was brilliant. Was going to go to Georgia Tech engineering, full ride, brilliant person. They had the misfortune of having a brain tumor and had hypothalamic induced obesity, and just what you were saying, could not stop this craving and would go into a grocery store, go into a 7-Eleven or thing and see the food and just have to have it and grab the food, and take off. And so he lost his scholarship because he just couldn't go mainstream. He had a woman with Prader-Willi syndrome who the parents would do everything they could, would escape from the house, go to the McDonald's, and go into a dumpster and eat the food that was thrown out. So these are really severe disorders. And just giving an appetite suppressant isn't going to work. And so you're absolutely right. It really calls for something that can go in and try to correct that short circuit, that neural network that's not responding appropriately. And we really do believe that psilocybin has the potential to do that. And here's the other thing. Again, we're talking about from a drug development standpoint. We all know that psilocybin has a biologic effect. People go, you take it, and it induces a psychedelic hallucinogenic state. So really, what you want to do is, how do you harness that, and how do you position it and use it to treat these medical conditions? The biology is known. It's not like we don't know what it does. We do know what it does. And therefore, how do you use it and maximize its potential in these patient populations? And that's what you're familiar with. How do you create a paradigm that involves both psychotherapy with the drug, both before, during, and after, to get the maximum clinical effect and beneficial effect?
There's a piece that I wanted to talk around as a therapist, the clinical protocols, kind of in the clinical trials that you've got, yes,
Mm-hmm.
but more so once, hopefully this gets approved and it's available in real life.
Mm-hmm.
How much importance is there on the clinical protocols, on kind of the therapeutic interventions when working with people? And we've kind of talked about it already. It's not just you take a pill every day.
Yeah.
It's just a couple of pills, and so much of that is around behavioral change and lifestyle change.
So what I can say right now is the experience that we've had down at University of Florida, where we started the study, and what's important is this is a really integrated treatment paradigm. And when I was talking with Jesse Dallery, who's the lead psychologist there, he was saying how important it is in the 6 to 8 hours of preparation to really understand the patient, to understand uh, their background, how they feel, what their sense is going in, and to manage their expectations so that they understand what's going to happen when they're administered the psychedelic. The patients that we're using, for the most part, are naive, psychedelic naive. They've never done psychedelics, so they don't know what to expect. And some of them have some anxiety around that, about what's going to happen. And then to be there that entire time, with the patient, to basically be their tour guide, to help them through and assist them to get the most benefit, and then most importantly, the integration afterwards. And one of the recurring themes that you see here is that there's an initial benefit that you derive from the administration of a psychedelic, but how do you maintain that durability? And so, even if you have been successful in changing the switch, I think the therapist is going to be important to make sure that switch stays turned off, or that they maintain the benefit that they derive from their experience. And I think that's one of the, amongst other unknowns, that what's going to be an appropriate schedule. Is this something where they're going to have to come in once or twice a year? Certain things I've thought about is, after you have one or two interventions, could there be a maintenance dose? Could there be a lower dose where you, as a therapist, should do a Zoom call, and you just speak with the patient, lead them through? I think all these things need to be determined. Right now, where we're at, in this phase two areas, let's demonstrate that there's a benefit. And once we can demonstrate there's a benefit, then we can build in what's optimal to maintain that over a period of time. But as I started out, the thing that still amazes me is the durability of the response that they're seeing in addiction studies, in TRD, where 3 or 6 months later, they still see the benefits. So something fundamental has had to occur. And I think the therapist plays a large part in that. And the other question I get all the time, and you've probably heard this, is people will say, "So Jim, is it the therapist? Is it the drug? What is it?" My answer is, do you think the patient cares? If there's a benefit, that's all they care about. And the folks that we've spoken to, they said most of the people have tried therapy before and it hasn't really quite worked. And we do believe it's that combination of a trained therapist with the drug, um, getting access to these subconscious neural networks, and then the support afterwards, that's going to be the key. And our approach, again, the Tryp solution is a little bit different in that, we do customize our therapy uh, towards the patient. So probably 75% is the same, right? Set and setting and the preparation and building the rapport. But we certainly feel that the profile of someone who's overeating could be distinct from someone with chronic pain. And so we want to sort of customize that. So the psychotherapeutic approach is at least in line with that patient population, dealing with things that would be more relevant than, for example, in pain patients. And the group that we're working with, Fluence, they agreed with us when they did the psychotherapy. One of the first things they said for training was, "Hey, we're going to go down and meet with Dr. Miller to understand that patient population." So when we do the training, we also touch upon what is the issues with these patients, so that the therapist can understand the patient population that they're going to be interacting with. So when we did our training, that was part and parcel. Dr. Miller talked about the patients, about the background, and the folks at Fluence integrated that into the training of our therapists.
Great. Yeah, I've had, as well as doing trainings with psychedelics today, I had previously done trainings with Elizabeth Nielsen, Ingmar Gorman at Fluence, and
Okay.
really,
Yeah.
yeah, really appreciate what they're doing. I think it's great that your team decided to, have researchers, clinicians, and trainers that are, very experienced in the psychedelic space to work on those protocols. I think
Yeah.
it definitely probably helps with efficacy and getting them approved, I'd say. And I'm really interested, Jim, going back a little bit, a few minutes to what we were saying. We've established that there's this kind of sequence of doorways in the brain that leads the client to this off switch. And then we're talking about, well, I wonder what happens to that off switch a month or 6 months or 12 months later. Does it turn back on again? Does it need an extra dose? Does it need maybe some clinicians to continue doing behavioral work, kind of motivational work around there? And I guess the answer will be we don't really know. But do you have a hunch about what happens to that switch after the
So,
trial?
I think about this one a lot, Dave. And so one of the things I think is that, there could be environmental factors with the patient that, for whatever reason, the way they cope is with overeating or whatever that might be. Hey, it could be that for some of these individuals, it's a cure. I mean, I'm not going to advertise that, we're curing this, but, and then the other thing I started thinking about is, And that's why I said this whole field is fascinating. That if you look at binge eating disorder, okay, that's an indication, that's a diagnosis. That population is very heterogeneous, right? They're not all exactly the same. They have a symptom, they overeat, that is common, but what's driving that, what the background is, what could be responsible, is quite different. So what we may see is that there's some people who respond very well, and they could go years, or there may be other people who need more continued support. And I would say that could be the same thing with fibromyalgia. If you look at that, for a while, people didn't believe fibromyalgia was a real disorder. It wasn't even credible. And yet now, it was sort of like if they ruled out other indications, oh, then they had fibromyalgia. So again, very heterogeneous population. If you look at studies being done in PTSD, heterogeneous population. So I don't know if we're going to come up with a one shoe fits all. I think that we have to go in open minded and start out with an approved set of interventions. And then you're right, you're going to have to look and see what would be an approach. And maybe you're going to have to look at two in your clinical studies. That yes, you need a full blown intervention, just as you did in the first or second time, or there could be an opportunity where a smaller dose in conjunction with the therapist to just talk will maintain the benefit. And we're not quite there yet, but I think the most important thing is that we all go into it open minded and realize that we're in a new frontier, and that we have to consider things that that, oh, the people are doing low dose, they're all wrong, or the people are doing their, no, it could be that it's a combination of those things that give the best patient outcomes. And we'll see. I certainly I think about the potential need for combination therapy, where that maybe psilocybin alone isn't the magic bullet for everything. And the example I can give is, one of the areas I worked in is osteoarthritis. And osteoarthritis, there's some patients have inflammations, some don't. Okay. So if for example, in the patient with fibromyalgia, they have an inflammatory component, you may not get the best benefit of psilocybin because you do have some peripheral associated pain. So you want to take care of that. And so again, let's go into things and do it on a patient by patient basis, understand the patient's needs. And if they need to take Advil along with psilocybin, okay, let them. I mean, that's what they need for their benefit. And it could be something similar, for overeating, that they may need some other assistance that helps them. But let's think about that and just come up with the best overall treatment approach for the patient. And again, not putting a round peg in a square hole, but being open minded.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that these kind of disorders that you're focusing on are relatively, under the radar for most pharmaceutical companies, perhaps, and definitely in the psychedelics world. The PTSDs, the addiction, and the major depressive disorder get a lot of the attention. But these are maybe not so great in the numbers of people affected by these conditions, I assume. But also perhaps the treatments that are available are just really not so effective, and the medical world has been stumped for decades around how to treat them. Is that the
Yes.
correct assumption?
Yeah, I think it is. And so if let's start with fibromyalgia. So there are some approved products, for fibromyalgia. And I think there's a couple things going on there. You have Lyrica and Savella, and I'm not saying that those drugs aren't important and that they have certain utility, but one of the things that I started looking at is the distinction between neuropathic pain, which is a type of pain, and nosoplastic pain, which we're talking about. Neuropathic pain, it emanates for the most part in the nerves, whereas nosoplastic is in the brain. And so I think what could have account for the fact that only about 10% of fibromyalgia patients respond to existing therapies is because they're not overly effective in having an effect on the brain. and so that you see that the patients stop using it because, and then it's horrible. About over a third of patients with fibromyalgia end up taking opioids, and we know, what a tenuous position that can be. And so it could be that, those drugs are great, but they really don't target what you need to change in fibromyalgia. And when we talk about these neural networks, I'm not really good at abstract things. And so I always have to relate, as I mentioned, with phantom limb. But one of the other things I was thinking about the neural networks is how many times we're all in a car or whatever, we're someplace, and you hear a couple chords to music, and you just you know exactly what the song is, and you know all the lyrics. You didn't sit there and memorize them like you do homework, right? It's there. That neural network is just floating around, and you turn it on, and it gets turned on through this auditory stimulus, and so it's there. And so it just shows that it's almost like RAM memory. There's these neural networks floating around there, and how do you access them? And they see this even in patients with Alzheimer's, that they may not remember their children's names, but you put on a Frank Sinatra song, and they wait, and they know all the lyrics, so that neural network is still there. So it's really, we know that switch is in there. We know that there's something that has to be changed. It's how do you get to it, and that comes back to the power of the psychedelics, and knowing that it does have an effect on neural networks. And how do you create the environment? How do you create a situation where you can capitalize on that?
Very briefly, Jim, I was checking out your website, and part of what you're working on is a proprietary delivery mechanism for the psilocybin.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us to what extent that's to do with the blood-brain barrier and the bioavailability of the psilocybin? As much as you feel that you can share at this stage.
Yeah, so it goes back to the way I was explaining it before, is that what we did is we looked at the deficiencies of oral, and we know that, yes, you have to have psilocin to get through the blood-brain barrier because it's lipophilic. And really what we did is we said, let's optimize on all the psilocybin like characteristics, but make sure we just get more consistent, more reproducible blood levels, and in a fashion that we can control, so that it's under the therapist, the physician's control. I think that helps the patient understand as well. As I said before, David, if someone takes a capsule, that's it. You just got to go through the whole thing. If you're able to terminate where patients not having a good trip, or extend it, that's what we want. We want the patient to understand that the physician can do that. So 8803, in its novel route of administration, its novel formulation, and it's, again, I can't wait till we can set its slight differences, really just provide for a better likelihood of an outcome. And when I shared this with Robin, he thought he had guessed what it was, and he came very close. And he just thought, when he heard, he goes, "Ah, man, what a great idea!" And other people have thought about it, and we can't wait till we can, divulge more information on that. We're getting closer. We're improving our IP portfolio. We'll be submitting additional patents in the near term, and we do think that when people look at it, they'll feel that, wow, that's really going to make everything uh, just better. And one of the things that you had mentioned is, when you think about this in the future, right? How is it going to be administered? And if you're going to have clinics for this type of treatment, if you have that level of variability, and where the patient and two therapists are tied up in a room for 10 or 12 hours, that's a pretty big burden for the therapist and for the patient. Whereas if you have something that's very precise, where it's a couple hours and the therapist knows what's going to happen. We're doing things now with EEG and fMRI and all the things that Robin did, so we can understand exactly what it takes to enter the psychedelic state, how long it takes to exit. So we're doing all the rigorous, boring science behind this so that we understand, yeah, exactly what what's being done. And I've said this before to people. I was meeting some folks at UCSF who again are experts in the field. We're going out to dinner and you get a little intimidated. These folks really know what's going on. And they're asking me at dinner, so Jim, what are you actually trying to achieve, with all this science? And my answer was, we're trying to demystify the mystical experience. And what I meant by that is that we're really just trying to understand it. We're really trying to just gain some scientific knowledge of what goes on. And the better we understand it, I think the better it can be used. And I also think if you think about who your target is. You're going to have two targets. You're going to have physicians and patients. The physicians want to be comfortable that this is safe and effective. And the more comfortable they are, I think patients will be. So the more that you can explain it to them, I think it's going to be better accepted as well.
I got to say, I'm pleased to hear how much of your work and vision involves and perhaps revolves around the mystical experience and the true kind of psychedelic experience. That there's something there that happens, and I hope you don't demystify it, because I truly think it's impossible to do. But it's great that that's part of this work, because I think some companies are trying to block that out. And I understand the benefits of, say, having a 2 or 3 hour trip instead of a 6 to 8 hour trip, and how that affects the healthcare infrastructure. I really do. But I think to try and get rid of the mystical experience and to get rid of the trip.
No, it's not. No. And in fact, that was the first question I asked Robin. I said, Robin, do you have to have a full psychedelic mystical experience for a positive? And he said, absolutely. He absolutely believes it. So when I say that, I'm trying to look at it more from, what neural networks are turned on, what happens in brain activity. And in fact, one of the things that we're doing is we're creating a consortium, if you will, where scientists can share imaging data, because a lot of Robins did fMRI, and so what they can do is across different patients with different indications. Hey, is there any similarity? Is there any differences? What happens post administration, to just get a better understanding of the biology? And no, here's an example. People have asked, and I don't know the answer. They're looking at what happens if you basically sedate someone so that they sleep through the mystical experience. Would they get a benefit? Nobody knows that. My sense is maybe not. And so, yeah, I'm a proponent for optimizing the mystical experience. When I say demystified, I just mean so that we understand it better, to get a better understanding of exactly what's going on. And I think, given and I'll say this, the bad rep that psychedelics have, being a Schedule 1 drug, the better you understand it, the more acceptability you'll get. And the very interesting thing is that, a definition of a Schedule 1 drug has no clinical benefit. Well, I think we're beyond the point that it looks like psychedelics and psilocybin has some clinical benefit, and which is another whole area for us to discuss in the future. But one of the most difficult things right now to do clinical studies is to get all of the license necessary from the DEA in order to be able to initiate a study. So, in Michigan, University of Michigan, we got FDA notice to proceed in December. There's a chance we might not be able to dose until the end of the summer, because you have to go through all the legal regulatory on the drug side, not the FDA, but the DEA. And every state is different. So think about what you need to do to get a drug approved. You need to do clinical studies. You're going to go to multiple states, which means now you have to navigate the DEA in every single different state in order to even be able to start your clinical studies. So there's some things that we're hoping will change as institutions like Johns Hopkins and UCSF and Yale and NYU start doing the really fundamental research with psychedelics, that it'll be changed so it's not Schedule 1. You don't have to encounter all of these difficulties on top of everything else, because I think that will help facilitate additional clinical research and determine what the benefits are going to be.
If there was a state, and there are, that have, say, decriminalized psilocybin, would
Mm.
Trip work there doing clinical trials if that was to speed up the timeline?
Well, absolutely. One of the things we're doing right now is we plan for success. I'm the world's biggest optimist. And so, what we're doing is we're actually talking to clinical research organizations and clinical sites who have wonderful expertise in eating disorders or in pain and say, hey, if you're interested in this, what we want you to do is to go and find out what it's going to take for you to be able to administer a Schedule One drug. And oh, by the way, you're also going to need to have trained psychotherapists on board. And so if you want to be considered to participate in our future studies, you need to do some homework ahead of time. So we're little by little, that's exactly what we're doing. And I can tell you a difference. In Florida, they were able to go through the DEA pretty quickly compared to Michigan. So you're absolutely right. Part of what we'll have to look at is, hey, it's a great clinical site, but it's going to take them 9 months to start. So that's a problem. So we will be looking at sites. We'll be looking at sites in Canada. In Canada, there could be some opportunities as well. So we'll look at where they have the requisite expertise and ability to do it, but also where it's going to be a little bit easier to actually conduct a study.
Yeah, the really interesting point, isn't it, that the DEA is not, a universal kind of standard throughout each of the states. It really does differ state by state. And we've been hearing that from a lot of people, even regarding ketamine.
Yeah, yeah. So you have to have the state approval and a federal approval. So, you know, people think the FDA is difficult, and I'm not saying, they're rigorous. Hey, they're protecting people, but you're on a clock. It's on a 30-day clock for the most part, and you know what to expect. Of course, you can be put on clinical hold, but there's a review period. With the DEA, that's not the case. There's no clock. And in deference to them, their major, their major focus is on, illegal drug smuggling and things. They're not thinking about clinical studies. And so now they've actually started to form, groups within the DEA that works with the FDA to help them understand what's necessary. But that takes time. And so, yeah,
That was a frown
with the
and
capital
for
T.
everyone listening.
and
Yeah.
and so you're absolutely right. As companies start preparing for success, they need to start thinking about exactly what states would be easier to do this. Because again, if you can have the best protocol in the world, but if you can't conduct a study, you're not going to get it done. So that's another consideration that comes into play.
Yeah. And so you've got the FDA and the DEA on your back, and the clock is ticking. You've also got shareholders on your back, Jim. So maybe just to close out, what's it like and how do you find it? Coming from biotech
Mm.
with a business background and now working, as psychedelic drug dev, what's it like having, a public listing on the CSE,
Yeah.
and the clock's ticking to kind of get this, this drug to the market?
So wait, do you have a wiretap on my phone? Yes, that's exactly. So part of what you're at, boy, it's not so easy because with the vagaries of the stock market, biotechs were down last year. Psychedelics, as we all know, took a real plunge, and so our approach, and speaking with folks such as yourself and others, is to say, okay, if people are interested in the psychedelic field and they want to invest, what horse are you going to pick? And so we're trying to say that Tryp represents a really great opportunity because we are thoughtful, we are mindful, we know how to get drugs developed. So if you want to get involved in this field, which we think has tremendous potential, Tryp is a good pick. And so our goal really is to start to generate some data and some results to justify that. And if I were sitting on the other side of the table and you say, hey, that's really great. Yeah, we know you guys know how to do drug development. You have INDs and you've picked two totally different areas, very exciting $1 billion opportunities. But how do you know it's going to work in those areas? And we can get all the experts to, on publications, but it's not as good as some preliminary data that shows that it's a benefit. So we think that keeping in focus, our heads down, creating some preliminary data to show that there is a benefit, this isn't going to be, a p value 0.001. This is basically from the people involved saying, wow, what a tremendous change in this person's behavior. And I've never seen anything like it. And the patient saying, oh my God, I struggled for 15 years. And now I'm not binging at all. I feel like I'm under control. I'm not anxious around food. I don't get depressed about thinking about I'm overweight. I feel like my whole life has changed around. So you have a couple of those people. I think from an investor standpoint, they'll come back to what I said before. There's a there, and that will give more credibility to the Tryp story and what our potential is. We've de-risked now what we're going forward. We're doing this cost effectively. We didn't jump into a big 200 patient study just assuming it's going to work. We're doing 10 patient studies to get to a point where we have a signal so that their investment is going to be well spent in taking us to the next level. So right now, I can't affect the Dow Jones Industrial. We can't. But what we can do is position Tryp so that when people start looking back at the field and realize its potential, that they feel Tryp is an attractive alternative. And I think by the broad spectrum of companies out there doing things, that you're starting to see, just as you said, in addiction, in TRD, in different areas, you're starting to see these beneficial outcomes in PTSD, so that it's going to get more and more attention that psychedelics have a benefit. And then who do you pick? And we think, obviously I'm biased, that we think Tryp is a very good pick if you want to get involved in the psychedelic sector. And that we're hoping that as we will get to a point where we can start talking about the results from our BED study, even qualitatively, that will be in a position to talk in more depth about 8803. They'll realize that we are really different and distinct, and that we put a lot of thought behind what we're doing. We're not just out there, doing things to get a press release. That we're really very mindful of what we're doing, and that we've certainly passionate about. We think that we're going to have a benefit. The folks that we're working with are equally passionate. And then it comes down to the molecule. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. We happen to think it's going to work. So,
can you tell me quickly about the timeline? So, forward-looking statements. What could we expect, and also from a capitalization perspective, how well capitalized are you with that kind of runway to get to the end?
So for me, on the science side, forget I would love to have, like some of the other award chests with $50, $100 million in the bank, because I think we could do many, many other things. So right now, we just completed a tranche for $4 million that we have, and we need to use that wisely for the things that we started. And we continue to talk to organizations and groups of other areas we like to pursue, but right now we need to get this data to move the program forward. And so I think that's our charge right now. Get some data, hopefully share that data, in the not too distant future on what's going on with binge eating. We because it's an open label study, one of the beauties is we sort of get real time readouts, and so that's encouraging for us. And so we hope if we can share that and then share 8803, that'll generate additional interest, and it will allow us to raise additional funds to do more studies. There's other areas that we are interested in, but you got to walk before you can run. And so right now, let's focus on what we have. We think we have, two good irons in the fire with BED and fibromyalgia. Try to share those results again qualitatively with the investment folks, so that they see it. And some of them may say, hey, until you do double-blind placebo-controlled study, we're not interested. Okay, but here's what we do have. And some people may not care if they get in at 15 cents or 45 cents. Other people may. So that it depends upon who your audience is. But for me right now, in leading the organization, is to do things correctly, to do it cost efficiently, on time. That's what the board needs to know that we're meeting our time frames, and we're working with KCSA so that they know what deliverables we'll have, and we think that with that information, we can raise the funds that we need, to continue our program. We're not going to go out and raise, $100 million. We're going to go out and raise what we need now, and then continue to prime the pump so that when we need additional resources to do bigger studies, we'll be in a position to do that. So um, we're taking a measured approach, which for me sometimes is difficult, because you want to go forward. But I think that's prudent to do now, and that's the approach we're taking. So.
Yeah, I definitely hear the dance that you're taking is kind of slow, consistent, focused, and relying on data to kind of just move you forwards incrementally. So that makes a lot of
Yeah,
sense.
look at Dave. So you can talk to talk, right? I'm here talking with you, but you got to walk the walk. So, and that's where people are at. They're saying, okay, yeah, what you're doing is intriguing. Okay, well, show it used to be show me the money. Well, show me the data, and so that's what we want to do. We want to be able to share with the investment community, and I think at a certain point you'll start seeing that folks in healthcare and biotech and pharma will start taking more notice. And we want to have the answers for them as well, not just retail investors. We want to be able to meet the scrutiny of the more traditional biotech investors, so that we have the requisite answers for them. Um, and so that's part of one of the hats I wear right now, is to make sure that we can you know give quality answers to investors. And I obviously know what those questions are. And so I just need to have the information to satisfy their questions.
Beautiful. And speaking of questions, I got an easy one to end our chat, Jim. You're in New Jersey, as am I. I've been here 7 years. How about you? How long have you been in town for?
So I've been in, so I grew up in Jersey. Okay. I went local high school, Roseville Catholic, played basketball there. Went up to Maine on a basketball scholarship. And so was there, then went to UConn for 5 years to get my PhD, and I was given to do my postdoc back here in 1979. So I've been in New Jersey since '79.
Oh,
So
wow.
a
Wow.
long time, yeah, longer than you've probably been on this earth.
I was
So
78. I arrived on Earth. So yeah, just about the same time. Yeah.
yeah, but hey, listen, you're in Teaneck, I'm here. Look at some point, go out and grab a beer. I'm sure when you were in New Zealand, you probably had a beer here or there.
Yeah,
And,
I like to partake. And I wanted to ask you about Jersey. When I've driven around that part of town where you are at, why are there so many pharmaceutical companies that have their headquarters there? What's your answer to that? Because there's just
yeah,
so many that are based
and
there.
it's really interesting. When I grew up, you had Merck, you had all of those. It's starting now to go out, but I don't know. I think it was being in the New York metropolitan area, areas for research, whatever. It's a great question, but like even when I was like doing my postdoc, so you had Pfizer in Connecticut at one point, but for the most part, the New York metropolitan area, mostly New Jersey, you had SmithKline French that was in Philly, and some of the others, but it was really East Coast dominated. And New Jersey, far and away, had the most. Now, if you go up in Boston, you have a lot of biotech up there, West Coast, but historically, yeah, pharmaceuticals were big in New Jersey.
Yeah,
Um,
it's our equivalent of Silicon Valley. Not quite as sexy
yeah,
and cool,
yeah,
but.
yeah. There you go. There you go.
But
Yeah.
anything else, Jim, that we didn't get to that you want to tell people about?
No, as I warned you, I have a tendency to chat, and that your ears are probably bleeding right now from all the discussion. But I'm really sort of passionate about this now. I do think that, in my nearly 40 years of working in this field, I just see, tremendous potential here, and it's up to people like myself and others in the industry to deliver that potential to the patients.
Yeah, thank you so much for spending all this time talking with me about what you're working on, Jim. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope you enjoyed it as well.
It's my pleasure. And yeah, like I said, anytime you have some follow-up questions, whatever, I'm always
Yeah.
happy to chat. All
Yeah,
right.
definitely looking forward to seeing the data come out and the
Yeah.
delivery mechanism you're working on.
Sure.
Looking forward. So yeah, Jim Gilligan from Tryp Therapeutics. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Appreciate the time.
Cheers, Jim. God bless.